Oh, hey there. Sorry about that. This week in community groups, we will be looking at Hosea 11, 1 through 11. And honestly, I'm kind of excited about this text, especially because I felt like last week's text was really just a difficult text to deal with. It was so heavy on judgment. But here we really see the heart of God for his people come out, and specifically with one image that kind of goes over the entire text. And in a lot of ways, what I want to encourage you with when you're looking at this with your community groups is to let this image actually sink in and to ask questions that would draw out thinking about this reality. So that image is God as parent. So the beginning of the text, the first 4 verses, speaks of God, how when they were young, he called them out like a son. Out of Egypt, I called my son. I taught Ephraim, which is again another word for the northern tribes of Israel. I taught Israel how to walk. I cared for them like a child. And yet in the midst of that, so where there's God's image as being a parent, it's the image of a parent who's rejected by their child. Now that just theologically can be something that we talk about, we think about like, oh yeah, God is rejected. But I would encourage you in the community groups to have a discussion around, have we ever seen parents who care for their children, who love their children, who do everything they can to care for their children, and yet their children walk away from them, reject that teaching, and live a different kind of life? I'm sure all of us have seen that. We've seen parents who love their children deeply become estranged from that child because the child thought that way of life, that way of living, that kind of discipline, anything like that was not for them. And so they walked away. And so we see this family fractured. And you can almost see it in them, in the parent's eyes, the one who brought this child into the world, how broken they truly are. That's the image that's being described here in the first 4 verses. God called his son out of Egypt. God taught Israel how to walk. He taught Israel to grow. He disciplined Israel so that Israel could become a man, could become someone who actually knows how to live. And what he got in return was rejection. What he got in return was actually a people who didn't recognize that it was their parents who were caring for them. They didn't look at God and see that. They actually looked at everything else around and said, I get it from that. And again, that's something we've probably seen in other families. People who think that really where they get nourishment from, really where they get love from or something like that is their friends who are leading them astray. That's the image that's being brought up. And I want to encourage you in the community groups to talk about those kind of things. That's a heart issue that we need to reflect on. After those first 4 verses where that image is introduced, we then get into judgment again. So verses 5 through 7 talk about judgment once again. But while we talk about that, we want to be making sure we understand that this is because they didn't turn to the God. They would not return to the Lord, and so God sent them into judgment. And here he explicitly says they're not going to go back to Egypt specifically, but they will return to Egypt in a sense because they'll go to Assyria. Assyria shall rule over them. Assyria shall dominate them. And so what's significant about that again is this idea of reversal salvation. That God, in Hosea 11:1, brought them out of Egypt, and now he essentially is sending them back to Egypt. But, staying on that image of God as being their parent, in verses 8 through 11, God comes back to this idea that even though he will judge them, even though he will discipline them in this kind of way, his heart will still go to them. He says, how can I give you up, O Ephraim? How can I hand you over, O Israel? So God is like a parent who, even though he disciplines his child, even though he's upset and so does certain things against them, his heart is always going after them. And so God, this is the merciful faithfulness that God has for his people. His heart will still go after them. Even though they reject him, God will do everything for them. And I want us to notice that kind of reversal there. That God explains in verse 5 that he will send them to Assyria because they have refused to return to me. Okay, but what God will do for them as a loving parent who shows merciful faithfulness, as he explains at the end of our text, he will return them to their homes. He'll bring them back one day. Even though they refuse to return, like a loving parent who relentlessly loves their child, God will still have compassion. God will help them. God will draw them back to himself. And that ultimately happens through Jesus Christ. In fact, that's what I think Matthew, in Matthew 2:15 is really talking about when he quotes there. He's saying that Jesus is the one who will do this. Jesus is the one who's repeating the things that Israel does because Jesus is showing that because Matthew is showing that ultimately Jesus is the one who God will use to bring the people back to the Lord. Even though they keep on rejecting him, through Jesus we can be adopted into this family. We can be brought back to our homes. We can be brought back to see God as our parent who has cared for us, who has loved us. So I hope that's helpful. I hope you can kind of stay on that image, get those heart issues, asking how has God cared for you? Do you always recognize those kind of things? And do you understand the heart of God, that even when we rejected him, he still, like a loving parent, still came after us relentlessly, and he himself has returned us to him. All right, hope you have a great week.